Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast.
Welcome to the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. I'm Rhombus Tix, and this is actually the last in a series called Swamp Castle. I'm going to be doing this one in a two-parter because I'm going to be ending the series in a second commentary / story to kind of provide context for one of the reasons why I'm doing this series, as well as my insight into the story. So today I'm just going to be reading the story, and then next week you'll hear my commentary on the story, as well as wrapping up the podcast, or wrapping up this series for the podcast. Unfood by Rhombus Tix. Freight Kasnigat was dying. He knew why now. It was unfood. It tasted like food. It smelled like food. It felt like food. But it wasn't. No matter how much he wanted it to be. But that didn't stop him from looking at the ship's console one more time. The dark, misty corridors all looked alike to him. He was trapped like a rat. But there was no cheese at the end of this maze. This was particularly ironic since for the past 2 weeks he'd eaten better than he ever had in his entire life. The job had started out simply enough. He was approached by a fat blob who wanted him to smuggle some food. Work was scarce for independent pilots here ever since the cheat gate had opened up, and the amount the blob had been willing to pay was obscene. The console lit up. It took Freight a moment to figure out what might have caused it. He sat up straight in his chair, causing his bandolier to jab painfully into his ribs. It was a life form of some kind. He started to run and then felt pain in his kidneys. Everything hurt. He slowed down a little. Impossible fantasies of rescue wove around in his head. It could be someone else, but how? He'd never seen any hint of them. Aliens? Freight laughed until his belly hurt, which was about 2 seconds. He took all the escalators and elevators he could to conserve calories. Laziness was the strategy for survival now. He arrived at the spot indicated on the console and looked around. It was just a structure in the middle of the two corridors. No one was there. Nothing was there. What in the hell was giving off the reading? He listened. Then he heard something scurry. He checked his comm. The scurrying was still there, but he didn't see it. Then he saw the well-worn sensor and groaned. Another false lead. He heard the scurrying again. He wasn't imagining it. He carefully tapped the wall and the noise increased. Using his ears and his comm, he kept tapping, following the noise until he saw a rat dash from one end of the corridor to the other. Quick as a flash, he drew his blaster and shot the thing. Instantly, it was burned to a crisp, and he cursed himself for not using the spear. Not that this made sense, of course, but his stomach didn't care. How many calories had he just wasted? Yet again, he cursed God. Yet again, he cursed the blob. Yet again, he cursed himself. Freight remembered the day the blob had come to him. He had just been cheated by a small contract with one of the red conglomerates. He had heard that they had a ruthless reputation, but reward at the time had seemed worth the risk. Once he'd hit port, the bribed customs officials had been arrested in a massive sting operation. Freight had been the scapegoat, and only his immediate cooperation had been enough to stave off jail time. But the financial penalty to his corporation had been barely enough to clear the docking fees to get his ship into space again. Then the blob showed up. He said,
"Have you ever heard of the Gem of Doom?"
"Can't say that I have." Freight put down the spanner he used as a chew toy when he was nervous or deep in thought.
"It's horrible, beyond horror. The insurance cartel mandates a minimum level of vivaciousness from all upper-level employees. I'm not an employee. I'm supposed to be rich, but for tax purposes, I have to stay on as CEO of the board of the family company."
The blob waddled back and forth and sat in Freight's guest chair.
"I'm fat. I like being fat. It's a sign of office, a badge of honor. The insurance cartel says it sets a bad example. They keep sending me to fat camps, and I keep finding ways to bypass their stupid system. Now they have something new. A ship with almost no food, cloaked in the depths of space where no one can find it."
Freight was certainly impressed with how nervous the blob looked.
I can't go hungry. Have you ever known true hunger, Captain Kusnicket?
Can't say that I have, not honestly.
Well, I have, and I wouldn't wish it on anyone. I'm prepared to pay you 3 million credits to shadow us and smuggle me a candy bar. Yes, that's right, just one. My people say that there's room only for one rendezvous, and the ship's scanners are too advanced to try and smuggle anything more on board. But just one candy bar will be worth it. This isn't about hunger anymore. It's about the principle of the thing. Tell me, are you in, Captain?
How could Freight argue with luck like that? So he loaded up the ship and headed to the coordinates that the blob had given him. It seemed like a simple job. Of course, that should have been Freight's first indication that something was wrong. He never got easy jobs. 3 weeks later, he saw the ship on the edge of his radar. The telemetry said that it was owned by the Helmonte Corporation. It had a number but no name. Bad luck. Very bad luck. Most corporations allowed their ships to be named, but a few considered it a waste of time. Freight opened up the sensor suite to see if the fat ship was scanning. It wasn't. That was a good thing. Theoretically, he moved the ship up alongside the airlock where he was supposed to meet the blob. He waited 3 hours, and the ship still continued moving along without lighting up its sensors once. How could the crew allow that? Letting a ship run without sensors was a good way to lose the ship. Finally, he risked a ping and found out that there wasn't anybody on the ship. Freight swore. What the hell was going on? He opened up the airlock and went inside. It was eerily empty. He checked the log in the captain's suite. It was extremely well decorated. It was an extremely well decorated wood-paneled office. Freight discovered that somehow the Helmonte Corporation had gotten word that Freight was coming. Rather than allow the clients to get away with it, they'd taken them to a rented maximum security prison to shuffle all the clients off and to prevent any of them from escaping. They'd sent the ship back along its regular course. Great. So much for the delivery. Freight wasn't going to break into prison for the blob. Freight cracked open the base and began to chow down on the spricky-spranky snack bar. It was okay, but the vibe had gotten a little weird in the cargo hold. He began to explore the ship. Freight had to admit he was curious about what the heck was going on. An alarm went off on his wrist base. He looked up and saw that the airlock had disconnected. Panicked, Freight put on his helmet and ran as fast as he could back to the ship. He moved through the corridors, trying to cut a few corners, though in a few cases he was forced to double back. At one point, the gravity plates between the sections hadn't been aligned properly, and he tripped. He hit his head on the bulkhead and was knocked unconscious. When he came to, his ship was long gone, and he was locked out of all the controls in the Helmonte ship. They'd set the Helmonte for a long, slow cruise of 3 months, which meant he was stuck here without any of his gear for at least that long. And that was assuming he wasn't arrested for transpassing. He remembered the first bite of Unfood he tasted. It was incredible. Most food for people of his wage level was artificial on some level. You knew it was fake food, but you lived with it. You only had real food for special occasions like Corp Day, Christmas, or the 4th. You could always taste the faint hint of soy or algae or something else that turned the real stuff that they made the real stuff from and made it to mimic something else. But this stuff was different. It tasted just like real food. The bizarre videos he'd seen explaining the nature of the fat cruise had all been saying that the food had no calories at all, that you could eat as much as you wanted and not gain any weight. Freight had never really known he could eat so much that he'd grow as fat as most of the richer folks, but he knew good food when he tasted it. It had been almost 5 days before he'd bothered to eat anything real, and it tasted horrible by comparison. The Spricky-Spracky snack bar had been designed to have exactly 500 calories. It was designed to be part of a nutritiously balanced meal, yet most of the time on long voyages, it was pretty much the whole meal. Intellectually, he knew that he had to have some calories, but compared to the amazing foods he'd been tasting, it tasted like shit. Mashed potatoes, handmade Italian pasta, fresh roasted vegetable medley, New York strip sirloin steak, creme brulee. The scents and sounds were amazing. The machine could manufacture whatever he wished. He'd even tried more conventional food like yuck burgers or fish sticks, but they were with real food, and he could taste the difference. Somehow the machine scrubbed out the purifiers and the preservatives and the mood enhancers and the quasi-addictors. With all of the additional chemicals, he was in bliss. It was a tasteful extravaganza that he never wanted to give up, until his stomach started to hurt. Freight took a break and drank some water. He figured he'd eaten just too much, and he felt he'd feel better after a few hours, but then he still felt weak. Oh, how glorious were the scents. Freight had attended the zoos and botanical gardens as part of his creche, just like anybody else. His self-imposed economic doom had only occurred when he'd skipped out as soon as he was legally able. He wanted to see the stars, and while adventure paid in many ways, it was hardly a lucrative career. The smells he had collected there had slowly built up, and he realized he had a nose for living things. He could discern the subtle differences between one kind of living thing and another. The keepers were quite astonished, and in high school he tried to join a wine tasting club. Unfortunately, he had been on a regressive planet, which was quite strict about such things. He had tried a few times since leaving, always looking out of place in his utilitarian jumpsuits among the latest fashion trends. He enjoyed the scents, but he hated the company. They were fake. The scents were not. And yet here he could smell the food and could not tell the difference. The heavenly aromas made his mind bleed with yearnings of unfulfilled desires. It was a heaven in which he intended to indulge. Since he had as much as he could eat, he began to go through the menu alphabetically. Aardvark, artichokes. He sampled a little bit at a time all the way until he got to butterscotch. The thing had thousands upon thousands of different recipes. At this rate, he'd not even finished by the time he was rescued. He decided only to try the popular dishes for now. On the 7th day, God rested, and Freight knew pain. He'd never felt real hunger before. The food might be crap and might always be scrambling for more. He might always be scrambling for more of it, but a gnawing feeling hit his stomach, and it wasn't enough to quash it with Unfood. That helped, but he felt thin somehow, almost empty. And still the cornucopia yielded her unyielding boundary. The machine mixed and mingled the basic elements of life to create art. Rationally, he knew that the things he was eating were a masterfully created illusion. It mimicked with precise heuristic mastery the best techniques of the best chefs throughout the ages. Legions of them tirelessly working on digital culinary phantoms inside their virtual prison inside the machine. Of course, they were not sentient. The world had long since grown past such monstrosities. But the practical upside was that there were only over 100,000 years of passion for the cooking arts residing within that box. But the same mastery had been twisted to create that which provided no nourishment of any kind. Beyond dietary requirements, the meals made a careful regimen of vitamins and other basic building blocks for the human physiques. He knew something was wrong, but the machine was the only real entertainment on the ship. It wasn't that there weren't plenty of hollow cubes or games or the like, but Freight couldn't stand any of that. He'd always been a boots-on-the-ground kind of guy. It was why he'd become a pilot. He began making model buildings out of Unfood. He made a small hot dog town, a gingerbread house, and bridges made out of peanut butter. It took 2 days, but when he was done, he began to stomp through his creation like an avenging dark god, crushing the mashed potato people beneath his feet. He roared in triumph, but then the pain was absolutely overwhelming. He doubled over and almost blacked out. He lay there for an hour and a half. Something was clearly wrong. Freight had had more time to read the manual on the Creator. Time was not on his side. No ship would come for 3 months. Once he had learned that the cruise would be his tomb, he had simply given up and begun to relax. He would eventually be rescued, but doing time was a pilot's master skill. It was a special kind of mind that made the time pass in the void of space, and Freight was the best pilot he knew. None of it mattered. Oh, how deadly simple existing was. He managed to find a box of extremely stale buns that had mold on them. Freight put the buns in the microwave with a bit of water. He figured the microwave would kill the fungus, but the smell was absolutely horrible, rancid beyond imagining. The unpleasant odor of the fungus was magnified 1,000-fold when it was cooked. He drowned the food with some butterscotch pudding Unfood that made it more tolerable. He enjoyed the first decent night's sleep in 2 weeks. It wouldn't last. He did the math. Pilots had to be good with numbers, and all it took was a simple equation of calories. His minimum requirements for survival were 1,000 calories a day, 800 for a short periods of time. He had approximately 3,500 calories worth of real food left. With 75 days to go, that meant he only had 50 calories a day. It wasn't going to work. Basically, by finding the bread, he'd managed to buy himself another week. Freight had to find food, somehow, anywhere, anyhow. His movements were lethargic now. He had to conserve as much energy as possible. He disabled the gravity on the ship to make himself weightless to conserve energy. It would do horrible things to his bones, but right now he didn't care about that. Plus, he had all the calcium a man could want in the finest medical bay you'd ever be able to fit aboard a spaceship. He found a file that listed all the components on the ship and realized that the captain had allowed himself a few luxuries, given his clientele. He almost couldn't believe his luck. Slowly, with carefully choreographed movements, he made his way to the front of the ship and under the captain's cabin. His eyes riveted to the object of his salvation, a leather chair. The file had said something about chemicals in the tanning process being toxic, but the medbot could take care of that. Right now, if it had calories, he'd eat it. Just to be on the safe side, though, he'd focus only on the stuffing and inside of the leather for now. After a few minutes, he began to sweat. He couldn't afford sweat, but plunging the thick leather utility knife into the chair to get at its insides had been a lot more work than he thought. He stopped. He couldn't do it like this. He had to think smarter. If only they had a damn robot. And then he realized that he did have a robot, a rather sophisticated one at that. He'd seen it on the ship's manifest. He raced, walked fast, down to the control room and activated it remotely. It was designed to perform external repairs on the ship, but there was no reason he couldn't bring it inside. He flicked the switches on one by one, turning it on. He quickly moved through the camera interface and pointed it to the airlock, directing it inside. The green light on the console flicked its affirmative. He wanted to rush down to the airlock to meet it, but it might not be much company, but it was kind of like a person, even if it was only a sensor drone. He named it Bob. Bob entered the airlock and slowly made its way towards the bridge. Freight redirected it towards the chair. Bob was a squat horizontal cylinder with two giant humanoid arms which could mimic the actions with great precision of one of the crew members inside. Bob would never have been able to function inside the ship with the gravity on, but here that wasn't going to be a problem. He had the computer bring up a holographic interface and moved carefully, his arms in sync with Bob's. He opened the door and guided Bob to the chair. Moving the chair with the weight off was easy. He picked it up and took it with him. Then he dumped it into the creator. The software of the creator did not like this. While it was perfectly capable of preparing real food, the overrides on the chemicals were huge, and convincing it that the leather and wood were fit to be included in the food took a lot of work. He didn't stop there. Once he'd done all of the work he could, manage to convince the creator to fix the leather from the chair into the wood itself. But wait, there was wood in the chair. Cellulose. Eureka. The computer was dubious that any calories it might have would be good, but beggars can't be choosers. He would take what he could get. The final hurdle was convincing the damn computer that he didn't need to do a corresponding amount of exercise to make up for the calories he was consuming.
Subject 502, the computer's way of referring to him, is not an authorized crew member. Subject 502 must not be allowed caloric profit.
That was about as close as the computer ever came to swearing. He hadn't been able to convince it that he was a crew member. Since this was essentially a prison ship for fat people, the security protocols were ridiculous. But he was able to convince it that the crew had given him a temporary waiver. Subject 502 has a temporary waiver for good behavior. Congratulations, Subject 502. God help him if he ran out of waivers. Chair Brief Stroganoff it was, and it was delicious. That gave him another 200 calories a day if he was very careful and used the med bay properly. He'd still have to find more calories, but where there was a chair, there had to be more hidden surprises. He had Bob begin a low sweep of the area using chemical sensors to look for organic molecules. It followed a slow pattern to increase its efficiency. Bob wasn't designed for this kind of thing, but most drones use the same operating system, which made getting them to do unconventional things wasn't all that hard. In the meantime, Freight continued to examine the ship's data stores for ideas on how to stay alive. If this had been a normal ship, the hydroponics section would have been a veritable utopia of ideas. But they didn't have a traditional hydroponics setup. Instead, they used some kind of fungus. But wait, fungus might be edible. He read up on it, and it appears to be a bioengineered organism specifically designed to be incompatible with the human digestive tract. Ridiculous. If only the wealthy hadn't been so damn determined to stay fat at any cost. This was impossible. Frank slammed his hand into on the computer in frustration, and as a result flew himself across the room and smashed the back of his head, knocking himself unconscious. Freight woke up early. His head was killing him, and he was covered in blood. His first thought was not, "Oh my God, I'm going to die," but "I can't afford to lose any more calories." He moved over to the ship medbay and lay down on it. He'd known it was good before, but with a series of robotic arms came out and began to administer local anesthetic, clean and disinfect the wound, and then seal the wound with temporary stitches, he was truly impressed. His immediate second thought was whether or not any of the drugs inside of the medbay might be consumable. But he wasn't going to be exploring anything right away. He had a mental note to hook the ship's computer to his comm so he could access it from anywhere when he was done. As he lay there longer, he began to feel more and more nauseated. Was there something wrong with the medicine the machine had given him? He felt something build up in the bottom of his stomach, and his gag reflex began to kick in. He stubbornly refused to release it. He needed those calories, but in the end he could not help but hurl into the waiting tube of the med bay happily provided him. He'd had a toxic reaction to the chemicals in the leather, of course. He began briefly to whether where the vomit went. Maybe he could feed it back to the creator. The thought made him hurl again into the tube provided by the medical bay. He laid his head down. He was going to die. He just had to accept the fact that he was going to die, and there was nothing he could do about it. He had plenty of anesthetics here. He would simply be a matter of telling the machine, well, no, that probably wouldn't work, this was a prison ship, not a sanitarium. Hell, the airlock would do if he needed it. For a few moments, he morbidly thought what was the most efficient way of doing it might be. The more analytical part of his mind kept returning to the vomit, however. With the creator, he could reclaim those calories, and it would taste delicious. He kept hurling into the tube, even when there was nothing left to hurl. He wanted to die. Even the thought of taking revenge on the blob wasn't enough to keep him going. And a ship captain's life was a lonely one. It wasn't really like anyone would miss him when he was gone. And yet, despite the circumstances, he couldn't give up. Not until he absolutely had no other choice. Once he had that thought, his mind began to drift on to what other calories he might be able to reclaim. The thought had made him even more nauseated. Then he heard the alarm that Bob was sending him. It had completed its scan. Freight rolled over to the other side and slowly crawled off the table and then floated down the hall. It was getting hard to think. Then he remembered that thinking took calories just like anything else, but this time he couldn't stop it, and more importantly, it was the only way he was going to stay alive, assuming that was an option. Bob's data was largely unreadable at first, just a few squiggles and lines. Computer, make this make sense. The computer immediately obliged by putting an overlay of the ship on top of the data. There was organic material, all right, but making sense of it all was going to require some work. 3 hours worth of work, in fact. He wasn't a scientist or a sensor technician. He didn't normally need to work with chemical sensors. As near as he could tell, there was a lot of promising leads in the crew quarters. He'd searched them before, but it made sense that he'd missed some things. After all, the crew was not going to be able to hide from both the company and the fat bastards. They were trying to find food. He had Bob focus on one of the quarters at a time, taking it apart bit by bit. At first, Bob didn't discover anything, but since he had nothing to lose at this point and it wasn't him doing the work, he had Bob begin to cut the furniture apart and drill into the walls looking for hidden compartments. Shards of metal twisted this way and that. The sparks from the torch lit up the room like a tiny galaxy, and then in a low-light vision he could see Bob's display was a box. He had Bob cut it open and found candy. Glorious chocolate. It was perfect. The annoying part of his mind realized that he was stealing at this point, but given how much damage he had already done to the ship, he was doomed to indentured servitude somewhere anyway, unless he could find a way to escape. But none of that mattered. Right now, he had to stay alive. He had Bob carefully withdraw all of the edible bits, leaving the personal effects where he found them, and put them into a pile. Then he had Bob go to the next room. Things went on like this for several hours. He had to take multiple breaks to remain calm and focused, often taking a trip to the food room and having it whip up something delicious. Despite the fact that it wasn't real, he knew that he would actually miss this element of his captivity if he got out alive. When he was done, he floated down to the crew quarters to survey his new haul. There was a bottle of champagne, no doubt being saved for a special occasion. That could keep him alive for another day if he was careful about it. He found a large box of candy bars, which he presumed the crew member sold on the black market. That could certainly last a while. Freight should know. But the pride and joy of his collection was a pile of 10 Space Marine meals he found in the Master of Arms' cabin. He wasn't sure why they were there, but all told it represented about 25,000 calories. It was a godsend. Properly spaced out, he could make the calories move from an absolute joke to slim, but it might work. He still had to investigate. He blinked a moment, trying to clear his head. Something was wrong. He put his hand in front of his face and saw they were blurry for a moment. He felt a thin pressure on the back of his head. He sighed and slowly, patiently began to work his way out back to the med bay, but blacked out before he made it. He woke up with a second lump on his forehead and a splitting headache. He felt violently ill and moved to the bay. He ran another scan. Apparently, he'd received a concussion the first time, and it was causing some minor damage. It recommended plenty of rest and a healthy diet. Of course it did. He redid the math again. While he wasn't really back to where he'd started, if the medbot was to be believed, then his chances had become scarce indeed. It wasn't so much that he couldn't try to ignore the concussion, but it simply stated that his chances of survival were that much slimmer if he couldn't maintain an adequate diet. Freight sighed and looked at Bob. "What do you recommend, little buddy?" Bob, who was neither little nor his buddy, nor capable of answering, sat there. He wasn't going crazy. Well, the concussion might say otherwise. He'd enjoyed long periods of silence before. That was part of his line of work. But then again, he'd never come this close to a slow, lingering, agonizing death before. He briefly thought about writing up some kind of last will and testament, but anyone who cared about it was either dead or too distant to bother with. He took a deep breath. He had to think of outside the box here. While he could find ways to eat more calories, maybe what he really needed was a way to reduce the calories that he currently consumed. He put a query into the database about ways to reduce calories he currently consumed, and got some interesting results. There were some drugs that could reduce the number of calories he needed per day, but they each came with their own side effects. Fortunately, dietary consideration was something the ship's med bay was well prepared for. Jackpot. But even if the safety protocols eliminated, too much use would cause his body to shut down. Fred decided that he had to take a break. He floated out to one of the viewports to gaze at the stars. They were fantastic, and it was one of the reasons he hated being planetside. Their shocking white, blue, and red hues made him think of giant fireworks that had gone off somewhere and were frozen in time. For a few moments, he really wondered if it was all worth it. He'd loved his life until now, but this hardship, or worse, the hardship that he'd had yet to bear, just seemed too much. With the right drugs from the med lab, he could eat like a pig in slop and barely be coherent before he'd finally passed away. It was just the right... It was a right that even a prison ship could not deny its inmates. But in the end, he couldn't live like that. Might as well just be an inanimate object at that point. He was alive and scared, even if that was just his personal choice, but it made him think. He rushed back to the medical bay and checked his stock for cybernetic parts. It was extensive. To perform such a complex procedure using just the auto dock was risky, but he'd already been rolling the dice this many times, and if he didn't try, he was dead anyway. The most perverse part of him also realized that this could be a perfectly viable source of calories. And so he began a series of perverse choices, weighing the odds of success listed in the machine's database. What did he need? What did he not need? Which parts of him carried the most calories? Would it be better if he did it all at once or a little bit at a time? The sheer horror of it all finally caused him to snap. He was forced to flee the med bay and return to the mess hall. It was safe there. He ate plenty of comfort food. He just ate and ate and ate, and now he understood why the rich enjoyed being fat. A part of his mind knew that he couldn't gain any weight by doing this, but he simply couldn't make himself not do it. He could not make himself cut off his own hand and eat it. After he'd consumed so much it hurt, he just lay on the floor sulking. Occasionally, the lack of gravity would cause him to float away, but he stubbornly pulled himself back to it and lay there. He didn't want to think about anything. He just wanted it all to end. It just wasn't fair. Time passed, as it was wont to do. He sat there and stared at the clock for 5 more hours, just watching minutes of his life tick by, before he finally regained some sense of element to his sanity. All the while, his own body turned traitor against him, consuming itself by burning calories to beat off entropy. What a lie life was. The nature of the universe was destruction. He should just lie down and die. And then he remembered the waste. Such a choice. But as he contemplated going back to the medical bay, he could not make himself do it. He literally could not make himself do it. He would rather die. With a deep breath, he got off and went to the terminal. Apparently the ship had a low-level radiation sterilizer, so while it might be disgusting, It contained calories that he was going to need if he wasn't going to die. But he had Bob do it. He became detached from his own body, doubly removing his possession of Bob, processing bucketfuls at a time and then running them through the scanner. Then, of course, it had to be put in something. The creator cheerfully recommended all kinds of potential dishes. After all, it routinely had to hide the taste of meds that didn't taste good either. Finally, he chose strawberry ice cream. Bob brought him the plate. He kept the gravity on in the dining room. It just made eating a lot more pleasant. He looked at the plate. He looked at Bob. It was perfectly safe. It was perfectly safe. It was perfectly safe. He tried eating a spoonful and got dry heaves. He needed anti-nausea medicine for this, but that would mean going to the medical bay, and he couldn't do that. He could, however, send Bob. He looked at Bob. Bob looked back at him. He couldn't send Bob to the medical bay either. He wouldn't do that to Bob. He looked at the plate again. This would be a lot easier if he was starving to death. No, that wasn't true. He was starving to death. This would be a lot easier if he felt like he was starving to death. With iron will and 7 tries, he finally tried a bit of it. It tasted okay. Then he spit out the mouthful and washed his mouth several times. He reviewed his choices. Go to the medical bay, die, eat dung. He picked up another spoonful of ice cream and shoved it right in. On one level, it tasted pretty good. On another level, that just made it even worse. He was not going to be able to keep that down, which meant that he was going to have to make himself stop throwing things up. But he couldn't go to the med bay. Increasingly, death was looking more attractive. Bob, what would you do? Bob, of course, again, did not reply. Freight brought himself more time by eating food that he did have. He tried to make it last as long as possible, and for the most part he was successful. Denial was a state he was able to live in for another 35 days. Time passed wonderfully. He watched the vids, read books, chilled. He almost allowed himself the illusion that everything would be fine. And then the food ran out. He cursed himself. If he'd taken some of the cyberware, he might have been able to have just enough food to last until he was rescued. Now he had only hard choices left. Now his mind was once again clear. Now he could not enter denial. He stood in front of the airlock, and he couldn't do it. He pushed his hand to hover above the button that would open the airlock several times. He could not end it. He felt himself grow faint. He knew that if he had to choose soon, or hunger would make the choice for him. He began to move towards the medical bay. He tried very hard not to run. Running used calories he could not afford to lose. The homeway loomed up, and Freight swallowed. He liked his body. He did not want to lose it. He screamed in rage, and he knew that he could not afford the calories. Freight didn't care. He pounded the side of the wall. Finally, he resolved himself to do it. It would be painful, unbelievably painful, but it had to be done. He programmed the computer to run a series of complicated surgeries to knock him out in the process. He managed to detach himself from it all. He pretended it wasn't real. The final step was to have Bob restrain him. This was harder than it looked, but he managed it nonetheless. He couldn't afford to move around while he was under the anesthetic. Once he was sure he was secure enough, he said, Autodoc, initiate procedure. The machine spent several minutes calibrating itself, but injected himself with anesthetic right away. He could feel the warm malaise wash over him as he reconsidered the futility of it all. If only he'd never come onto the ship. If only he'd left more food. Maybe he could have used the sensors one more time to check for food. He stopped, his eyes snapping wide open. The sensors! He realized through the haze of anesthesia that he'd been an idiot all along. He wasn't entirely shut out of the ship's systems. He could create a distress call by setting up a coded sensor ping. It wasn't a foolproof plan, but it had better odds of success than this madness. He fought against the restraints and couldn't undo his arms. Autodoc, stop procedure. Please repeat request, he yawned. Autodoc. Please, it was no good. His speech was too slurred. He fought against the restraints with all his strength. His muscles had atrophied from weeks of zero-G and malnourishment. But he was still a man in his prime, and the restraints had only been meant to hold him while unconscious, he not fighting against him. He felt the restraints begin to give. Then the buzzsaw started. It let out a petulant whine and began to descend. Freight screamed and struggled harder against the restraints. He had no choice but to escape, since he had moved the machine since he'd moved, the machine could end up killing him now. The restraints began to break. The buzzsaw entered his skin and began to cut. This time, he screamed in pain, and the resulting additional adrenaline let him go free of the table. But he was bleeding profusely. Calorie loss he could ill afford. He immediately applied pressure to the wound and tried to stop the bleeding. He did a moderately good job, then he rushed to the sensor terminal. The anesthetic had begun to affect him more, and he couldn't speak to speed up the process. All he needed to do was send off an SOS. He set up a loop and then collapsed and slept. Captain Kusnigget? He could feel someone shaking him awake. Huh? He opened his eyes and saw a company tech. What? Are you Captain Kusnigget? Freight Kusnigget? Freight nodded. God damn, son. That was amazing. Freight nodded obligingly and then collapsed again. They didn't charge him, of course. That was what surprised him the most. No, strike that. What surprised him the most was the fact that so many people were willing to pay for his story. Not many stories of true hardship occurred on this side of the core worlds. Go figure. He was able to quietly retire to a rather rich world. He considered starting up his own business again, but was rich enough that he could pay someone else to do it for him and earn more money in the process. All he had to do was lean back and sip margaritas and let the profit roll in. What he wasn't able to do was sip those margaritas without having an approximate count of how many calories it had and how many he needed to have during the day to meet his minimum caloric requirements in the back of his mind. He sympathized with the fat.
This has been the Tossing Grenades at Windmills podcast. Buy my book, Have Name Will Travel, at Amazon and other markets. RedAnvilCreative.com contains all our podcasts. Copyright
2022!
To fight the forces of evil!